film, Poets in a Modern World. Nerves got the best of me earlier, so I wanted to name some people to thank. I want to thank the Betty Jayne Brimmer staff, Wendy, our lighting operator, and Andrew, our tech coordinator here. I want to thank Carol Cook, our event manager, and Jenny Parkers, the executive director. And my thanks extends to the KTV group. Thank you very much. Joy Kinsinger and Gabe Reedy, thank you so much for handling emissions. Jeff Ogden, thank you for recording this. I want to thank the cast and the crew of this project. So Wes Brooks, Rachel Walden, Beck Patusek, our first AC and grip, gaffer, Adam Mervin, our dolly grip, Giovanni Galindo, a grip, a dolly grip as well, the extras, Anna Ayler and Anthony Turner, and our sound recorder, Nick Daniel. So, thank you very much. I want to begin talking about this full-length project, Poet in a Modern World. It's a feature film I'd like to make here in my own city of Peoria. As you've seen, this project, A Moment Is Enough, was shot on 16mm film. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with 16mm film, cinema was born on the celluloid format. Films used to be projected on celluloid. Half the time you were sitting in a theater, you were immersed in darkness without your knowing, because 24 frames per second was flickering through the projector. So, Poet in a Modern World, the title comes from this notion that each of us are a poet of our own lives. That poetry is not something that is merely to be read, but it's something to live. And every action we take is a line in a poem. We are the authors of our own lives. And some of you might be wondering what this pin represents. It's a poppy flower. And in World War I, when Europe was ravaged, poppies emerged from the ground, from the graves of those who fought, these soldiers. And so it's an emblem of remembrance and endurance. We face a very bleak time right now, to say the least. I think all of us in some way are aware of the darkness we face. So the motif for Poet in a Modern World, it can be reduced to these two words: choose beauty. I want you to take a moment to think of something that's meaningful to you. That would be a work of art or poetry or literature, music perhaps. And if you were to try to describe why this thing is meaningful to you, you might find it to be very difficult, because its meaning transcends language. And this is what great art does. Great art points to something beyond us. Great art points to something greater. And so these two words are embodied by the two protagonists in the film. The backdrop is set, of course, in modernity, where the ideal in our Western civilization has been replaced with a question mark. We live in an age of skepticism now. There used to be a vision of what beauty is that united us, and united us particularly as a nation. And that has been replaced with anything. Anything goes. And if anything can be art or can be beautiful, then nothing is. And so the two protagonists find themselves struggling to live in this age of skepticism. They find themselves holding on to these old ideals, these seemingly antiquated principles. The protagonist that you saw in A Moment Is Enough is the young filmmaker. His name is Shane. He finds himself repelled by his family of Philistines, that is, people who disregard art and don't have any real in-depth relationship with it. And being a filmmaker and a young artist, art is something that connects him to meaning. And it's the bridge that connects him to something that helps him to exist, to be, to live in a world, because art ultimately reminds us of what matters. John is the instructor in the film, and he finds himself in a midlife malaise. He's suffering the aftermath of a recent divorce. He finds himself raising a daughter, a 9-year-old daughter, and he faces the question of, well, how can I have hope? How can I have hope with my daughter living in this world that is nearly devoid of meaning? The story, of course, follows these two individuals who possess an interesting dynamic. They're almost mere reflections of one another. Shane is the young person who gazes into the future and the future of possibilities and uncertainties. And John is someone who is now pining for home, for the home he lost, for the family he lost. We learn that his mother passed away and 7 years ago in the story, and he struggles to get over this because his mother was the only family he had. He loses this sense of belonging. He loses this family that he created with his wife, and now he also faces the question of the state of the educational institutions and how they're dwindling in regards to connecting our youth to these enduring truths, to these principles that shaped our civilization. And so he faces the question, well, how can I impart this wisdom, this knowledge onto them? John is accused of proselytizing to his student body. Students end up gathering outside of the campus in protest of his teaching, and John ends up being forced to resign. The story culminates into this question: what can be done to save our civilization from its crisis of meaning? And so A Moment Is Enough is a glimpse into the embodiment of that story and some of the motifs I just shared with you. We look into the world of Shane, who is locked inside the realm of imagination. And this is something that both characters struggle with. How can we face reality instead of escaping it? For them, art is this different realm to live in. How can they reconcile that? How can they hold the torch of hope for people? And so Shane finds himself oscillating between the world and this realm of ideals. And so we see that in this previous relationship he was in. It never really came to fruition. And he reminisces about this one girl who shares an entirely opposing worldview. And we see this painting for a brief moment. This is a painting by Titian. He was a late Renaissance artist, and this painting is entitled Sacred and Profane Love. On the left you have the profane woman, who symbolizes a love that is fettered to appetites and to ephemera. And on the right you have the sacred woman, who is holding the sacred lamp, the torch of divinity. It's a very mysterious painting. Scholars dispute what the meaning is, but there you have this juxtaposition between a woman whose gaze is towards the world and a woman whose gaze is towards something beyond it. And so there's validity in both positions. There's really no clear conclusions that are made in this brief short film in this scene, but we do see the truth in both sides. Lillian, the muse of Shane, sees just how unreasonable some of these ideals can be. And that's also a question that Poet in the Modern World explores. How can you balance attempting to attain ideals that are nearly unreachable and yet continue to endure and live through life and face reality and with the body. And then Shane, of course, has his eyes gazed to Plato's ideals, to those that are unfettered from the body, things that cannot be touched. This is a photograph from the making of A Moment Is Enough. As an independent filmmaker. You have to work with limited resources, and this is one of the real beauties to working within restrictions, because it entices you to become inventive. It encourages you to be a great problem solver. Unlike with studio projects where you have an excess of resources at your disposal, with independent filmmaking, you have restrictions, boundaries to work within, and that can be liberating. There's a quote in Poet in a Modern World. The instructor tells the students that limitations offer us unforeseeable possibilities. So this project, of course, as I shared, was shot on an older format. Young filmmakers are gravitating back towards it. And I think it's because we have this need for restrictions. We have this need for difficulty because it demands the most of us, the most from us. And that was my reason for transitioning into 16mm film. It really wasn't because of its aesthetic qualities, which, of course, the film is beautiful, and the digital format cannot imitate the colors that film renders, which is purely generated out of a chemical process. But I was interested in its aesthetics. It's the discipline that it demands from artists, because the format itself is extremely fragile. It's delicate to any kind of handling, to any light. You're handling life itself. You're carrying that, and you have to load it in these magazines, which require complete absence of light, so you have to use these light bags. And if you saw the slideshow earlier, there was a photograph of me loading a film magazine. This delicacy is kept in mind in the midst of creating. There's some more photographs. I built a dolly track out of PVC pipe, so it's just a little idea of what independent filmmaking is like. You learn how to work with little money and to use the most out of what you have. And there's the photograph, the aforementioned photograph of me loading a film magazine. The film unraveled, one of the rolls unraveled. So you have these spools that the film comes in, and you have to load that in the magazine on the feed side. And then the magazine takes it through this throat mechanism, which the shutter, which opens and closes, that lets in the light through the lens to expose the film. It travels through that throat to the other side of the takeout. And when I was unloading the magazine, of course, the film unspooled and unraveled. And I never had as much perspiration worked on my back than I did then. I delayed production for 2 hours, but we were able to manage. We were able to get everything photographed that we needed to get photographed on that day. And so this is the budget for Poet in a Modern World. $25,000. Most of the funds will be allocated towards the raw stock and the processing of the film. This is a little less than what it would cost to shoot digitally, actually. Today, if you want to shoot on the 4K format, you have to rent these costly cameras, and you have all of these accessories that you need to acquire. This project must be photographed on film, and I have most of the equipment already necessary. So I have C-stands, lighting equipment, and what have you, that we use to make a moment is enough. So most of everything that's needed in regards to equipment is in my own possession. And then, of course, a good portion of the funds will be allocated to the talent. You have the motif Choose Beauty, and I want to focus on these two words, Choose Peoria. Unlike most aspiring filmmakers who scurry to entertainment capitals to work in the industry, I've chosen to stay here. It's because I see tremendous potential here. Peoria used to be an entertainment mecca in the early 20th century, believe it or not. You have the phrase, will it play in Peoria, that originated from stage shows debuting their showings here to see if it would have success, because the heartland reflected the majority of our nation. And so if it had success in Peoria, then it would have success all around the country. So I'd like to revivify that. I want to see films made in the heartland, because the heartland hasn't been given a voice. We have mostly California generating our films, and that's a cultural minority, really, if you think about it. There's a specific experience in the Midwest, and there are certain stories that can only be told here. And I want to tell those stories. I want to remain here. I want to highlight the beauty of the Midwest, the beauty of Peoria, the beauty of Central Illinois. And so I have a photograph here of the Madison Theater, my goodness, thank you very much, which is now undergoing a renovation project. They're trying to acquire funds. But you had the chance to take a tour inside, took a photograph there, and it's a beautiful place. And of course, you have the wonderful Scottish Rite Cathedral, and then the Sacred Heart Church there. These are some of the locations I have in mind in terms of what might be featured in the film pertaining to the storyline. So a portion of the film takes place in the Midwest's nature. I want to feature the beautiful countryside. So these photographs are taken on top along Rock Island Trail, which is my favorite trail here in Peoria. There's some beautiful scenery you can see. John ends up taking solace in nature, and he decides to go out through nature and to paint these landscapes. On the bottom, you have, of course, you have St. Mary's Cathedral, the interior, beautiful interior of that church. And then there's this Melman sculpture, a sundial sculpture that's part of the ICC campus. So I want to close with this painting. This is a painting by a Russian romantic painter, Ivan Aivazovsky. It's entitled The Ninth Wave. And the ninth wave in seagoing culture was the most perilous wave after an onset of other dangerous waves. And so here you have seamen clinging to this broken mast that's almost symbolic of the cross. And in the background you have this strange celestial light. And I thought this painting was very evocative of our current circumstance. We have the turbulent waves of our epoch, but with all the skepticism and relativism and annihilation of certain ideals such as family. And so these seamen are clinging for dear life to this mast, their last hope. And yet this strange, miraculous light is coming from the distance, illuminating the night sky. And I think that if we want to see change, if we want to see beauty, we have to continually choose it. We have to embrace it, just like the seamen clinging to this mast for dear life. And not just for the time that we're here, but for all of posterity, for future generations, for our youth. We need to preserve the truths that endure, and that's the chief role of the humanities, to keep enduring truths from being forgotten. And that is what John, the protagonist in Poet of Modern World, is trying to do. To keep enduring truths from being forgotten. And so, my ambition with this film is to give people resolve, and to remind people of what matters. Ultimately, it's our relationships with one another. It's family. It's these ideals of beauty that keep us together. And so, this film is very dear to me, and Peoria is very dear to me. And so I wanted to share this short film, a little glimpse into this feature film project with all of you tonight. Hopefully it inspires you a little bit, maybe makes you think, hopefully. And thank you very much. Yes, well, there was a whole list, a whole slew of them. So on the first day of filming, the dolly seat snapped. So we had to replace that with a Apple box. That was quite interesting. And then all of a sudden that triggered all of these other problems. So electronics started to fail. There's this thing called a middle frame controller. It keeps the frame rate consistent on the camera. That broke. The wire shorted. The zoom controller broke, which controls the zoom. There's some of these zoom in shots, and there's this automated gear system that connects to the lens. And so that broke. There was a snow machine that I created that involved a drum being spun with perforated holes that had feathers fall out of the holes. That broke.
So really cool.
That never made the screen, but we managed. Didn't let anything deter me. And of course, I had that instance with the film unraveling and the light bag. That was probably the worst of everything. And only perhaps maybe a minute of footage was grazed because I had to handle that part of the film with my hands in the back to wind it back up. And luckily, the lab was able to take some of the footage being unwound and to scan. So that's a question people have pertaining to the feature film project. Well, what happens if you damage some of the film? I restored. I was uncredited as a digital restorationist. I restored some of the footage on that zoom-in shot of the Titian painting. So I had to, frame by frame, digitally remove some of these scratches and what have you.
That was my question. I noticed in the film there were those scratches that make up the gold. Was that put in there, or was that part of the actual process?
That was part of the actual film.
Oh,
yes.
That just comes out.
The real thing.
Yes, that's dust that perhaps entered the camera, or even part of the scanning process. So these labs, they have a scanning machine to digitize it, and so sometimes dust enters machines. Yes.
When you wrote the script, did you picture in your mind the camera angle, the shot, and all that, or did that come later?
Well, all of that occurred to me as I was writing the film. So I did storyboard this project,
Right.
and that was primarily to show those involved, helping out crew members, to see what my vision was,
Right.
so they can be prepared to help and accommodate that.
I think the storyboards look a lot like us. Resemblance of strength.
I did pull up some photographs of US. This is before we cast Rachel to refer to.
So, Will, when you were writing the script and thinking of the actors in mind, you gave a very heartfelt speech now on the importance of your film and what you wanted to speak to the audience. Did you find a challenge talking to and expressing to your actors like what you needed on screen in dealing with these actors? If you could talk on that a little bit.
Yes, well, a lot of that is achieving that rapport, that mutual understanding is done in the casting process. So I auditioned multiple people before I came to Wes and Rachel, and I was looking, I should give it a little more context. My approach to cinema, when it comes to performers, is to locate non-actors, people that are untrained or at least not formally trained, because I think, in my opinion, this is coming from an acting background, I've taken a couple of acting classes, I think it inhibits you. A lot of these techniques that you have, Meisner and Stanislavski and what have you, and I think it turns people away from accessing sincerity and real truth. And if you want to cast an actor or a performer to best represent the character, you find a soul that is harmonious, that is best resembles that person. So you don't have to ask the person to act that much. They can be themselves and they can live freely. So eventually I came across Wes, or the idea occurred to me to cast some. I came across Wes long ago at ICC. Him and I have been friends for a great deal, so I knew what he was capable of, and I knew a lot about him and his soul and how much it resembled the character that I wrote. And then Rachel, I came across her through Wes. Wes had recommended her, and we auditioned her, and I knew it then that she was right for the part. We had a brief conversation before the audition went on, and I knew that she had the spirit of Lillian. So.
Is Rachel being imagined by Wes in this, by Shane in the movie? Is that
correct?
Right, okay.
Yes. So, of course, you have Shane looking at social media photographs of Lillian on his laptop, and that's when he enters reminiscing. And through reminiscing, he comes to this memory where he's sharing the sounds of different liquids being poured on the ground. That came from an instance of a filmmaker that I dearly admire. His name was Andrei Tarkovsky. He was an eminent Russian filmmaker. And I was reading his collection of memories that actors and collaborators wrote about his life, and they shared this moment where he was pouring liquids on the ground. And it was such a beautiful expression of his soul, and so I thought it was quite harmonious to Shane and what he would be doing.
Being still and listening, taking it in, absorbing
Yes.
what God created.
Yes. And through that memory, Lillian is conjured in the room, and that's the instance where the projector is turned on.
I'll take a slightly different approach. I'd like to hear from Rachel and Wes a little bit. So I'll tell you what my impression of the film was, and then you can react and tell me whether it fits with what you were going for, or whether I completely missed what you were going for. So I guess by Rachel, I was actually very drawn in by her character, and I felt like she was really reaching out to Wes. She wanted them to get closer. But at the same time, she's challenging him with these very difficult questions. And Wes basically doesn't have an answer for her. And so I saw a lot of frustration and sadness in the part that Wes was playing. And I see that, I like that. It seems perfect then to ask the question, okay, where does it go from here? It's a good setup for the rest of the film to follow after this. If you could, is that what you were going for, or is that like completely off?
I saw Shane as someone who had a very intense inner world, and I could absolutely relate to him, as Will mentioned. And I saw him as someone who had an idea, a very good idea of what it was that he espoused, what it was that he really cared about, and what it was that he really wanted from life, and how he viewed life. And so I think what you see in this film, A Moment Is Enough, is Shane he has these convictions, and he's wrestling in this, and growing confident in them, and really upholding what is true and what is most beautiful. And what is most beautiful often involves sacrifice, and so you see those things play out.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. My idea or my experience of Lillian was someone that was strong-willed, but had this rich past with this person that she was very close with, but she wasn't going to give up on her convictions, and she wasn't going to compromise. And so she loves him and knows what it's like to be with him, but she refuses to give in. And I was always trying to win the battle. So the more frustrated he got, the more I was winning.
Your message for the film, like it can be seen in like all the modern world, but especially in the past year. Have you seen like a change in the film, or like a change in like the passion in the film from like when you first wrote it versus when you were filming it versus when you're seeing it today?
Unequivocally, yes. Yeah, this is a very interesting. The film the screenplay went through a very interesting metamorphosis. Its origins was quite a bashing, really. It wasn't near as important, I suppose, or serious as it is now. Certainly with the events in the last year, and with this pandemic and what have you, and just in the last decade, have shaped the story and refined it into something more true.
I'll just say, watching the film, I felt the emotion. I felt the mood, the very powerful. Yeah. Good job.
Thank you. Any more questions? Comments? Suggestions?
Uh-oh.
Not a suggestion, back to questions. But can you recall the very first moment where you said to yourself that you think you have a story to tell, whether you saw a glimpse of one of the characters or anything like that?
Yeah. Well, my discovery of Andrei Tarkovsky and Robert Bresson. Again, Andrei Tarkovsky is the Russian filmmaker I mentioned earlier, and Robert Bresson was a French filmmaker, and he was disputably the father of the French New Wave. His approach to cinema was quite minimalistic, and he didn't feature soundtracks. He actually liked sound design, more than images. He was a painter before he was a filmmaker too. And he used non-actors. He refused to call them actors or performers. He called them models. And he wrote a book called Notes on the Cinematograph. And I read that, and that really shaped my vision for this story. And then Andrei Tarkovsky's book, Sculpting in Time, also inspired me. And so, to answer your question, how did the story come to be? I came across this recorded interview with Andrei Tarkovsky, where he gave advice to young filmmakers, and he said, the problem I see is that too many filmmakers separate their life and their work. That they say one thing in their work and live another thing. And that really, the two should be the same. That there ought to be a sincerity, that there ought to be an honesty in sharing the particular worldview. Otherwise, you're lying to your audience. You're pretending. And I think our current film industry suffers that, unfortunately. Its infrastructure has now just been politicized. And so that's a long way to answer.
I guess I'll follow along with that. So, Will, you and I have actually talked about Tarkovsky, and I sort of told you how I struggle to connect to his films, so I'm not as big a fan of him as you are.
That's quite right. They're soporific for a lot of people.
So I can ask the hard question then, I guess, which is, I liked this film, but with specifically with the pacing, which is much slower than you're going to see in a Marvel movie or something like that.
Of course.
How have you had any difficulties like trying to find an audience for something like this?
Well, tonight's quite successful, I
It
guess.
is. I'm just curious. Have you thought about that, or have you concerns about it? Or?
Yeah, certainly I have concerns about it. I think modern cinema is too rapid, and we're barraged with soundtracks and blaring horns, and the editing is so rapid you can't even process sometimes what you're watching. And there are so many shots, so much footage is captured and not even used on occasion. I know the plight that a lot of filmmakers face today due to the digital format is that there's an excess of images, that people capture too much footage, and they never really use any of that. And they'll accumulate 172 hours of footage and only use 2.5 hours of it. And so I think we ought to respect time, because this is the medium of filmmaking. And so we have a relationship with time. And there are moments that we ought to give our utmost respect. I mean, you're creating an instance that's going to be repeated over and over and over again.
Sometimes we need to stop and listen to the silence.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
It's a very contemplative kind of filmmaking.
It was more of a suggestion to me, but it kind of reminds me of like the way how you're doing the film. It almost reminds me of like those old black and white films, like Casablanca, or the ones that have all those really like long storylines, like the one that they always used to play Thanksgiving.
Yes.
The angel, I cannot think of it.
It's a Wonderful Life.
Yes,
Frank
and
Capra.
how the struggle and conflict between the male protagonist and female protagonist, how there's always that conflict. And the favorite scene that I always liked from that movie was when he's talking about like throwing the rope on the lasso and pulling the tree
Yes.
down forward and everything. It kind of has that same kind of like slow pace feel, but you get the emotions from both sides of the characters to know like, yeah, they're developing a relationship of some sort, but you don't know what it is yet.
Right. Yes, we've lost that kind of romanticism in cinema today, and now it's turned into pornography for all I'm concerned, and that's a real tragedy. We've lost that one of those ideals that I spoke of, that love, that notion of divine love between two human beings.
What kind of things do you look for when you say, back to when you spoke on capturing the heart of the Midwest versus like Hollywood producers? What kind of scenes are you looking for?
What kind of scenes? What kind of stories? Ultimately stories about perennial truths and questions, really. I think, well, to quote St. Augustine in Confessions, he has, speaking about time and eternity, and he talks about how impossible it is to even think about the concept of time, let alone even to speak about it. And so time is a mystery, and that's what intrigues me about cinema, because you're exploring time, you're exploring this medium. And so I think it's a wonderful medium to utilize in order to ask questions and to explore our condition as spiritual beings, ultimately. And so those are the kind of stories I think everybody's thirsty to see. I don't think people are really being fed. I mean, their appetites, since they're being fed sensations, but it's expedient and it doesn't last. And people are ultimately hungry for something more, something that bridges into that that realm of the ideal.
It was wonderful, first of all.
Thank you.
I don't even know what to say. I'm just kind of awestruck.
Oh.
Both of you captured the roles just excellently. There's only one thing, just a suggestion. It's probably more for Will
Yes.
than you two.
I'm too tall?
No, no, no. No, that's not at all.
I'm too short.
Oh, first of all, let me say also, when you guys are so close, and I'm like, kiss her already. Which is cool because that leaves you wanting more, right? It leaves you wanting more. But the part where you put you bring down the sheet and you put it over your head and you're slowly taking it off. For me, I think I think if just to my way of thinking, I would have let she still seems happy, but I don't think I would have done the laugh because that is where the scene really turns. So serious. Again, it starts out very serious, but that's where you're watching Shane, and it's like happy, and then it's like, oh man, this is gonna get serious again.
She wants to pull him away from the seriousness. She wants to keep him in a lighthearted
That's true.
place so that they can stay connected. She doesn't want to.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. But even I could feel that that it was gonna go back to you, in your mind, being very serious again. But it was great. It was fantastic. So when you do this other big thing?
Yes.
Tomorrow?
Yeah, I need $25,000. So, what was your question?
She just wants to know if you're ready to do this one tomorrow.
Oh, am I ready?
The rest of it?
I have everything ready. I have most of everything ready. I need the actors. I have all of the equipment. I need the film, the raw stock. I spoke about that in the presentation. So I need to acquire 14,000 feet of footage. That gives me a 4-to-1 shooting ratio. So 4 takes for every scene. And that's what we utilized for A Moment Is Enough. And that was enough, no pun intended there. 14,000 feet, that's about a third of the budget, $25,000 to acquire that. That's about, if you compare it to the digital format, you have these cameras, these expensive cameras, 4K cameras, that cost anywhere around that price, if not more, just for the cameras alone. So it's actually less expensive because I have most of the equipment. I just need the money to acquire the film and also pay some of the talent and additional things.
I have 2 questions.
Yes.
Is he Will?
Yeah.
What? No, I'm asking.
He's Wes.
Do you think he's Will? Do you think your character is Will?
We consider him a kindred spirit, but
Yes.
the character did begin in a very autobiographical way for Will.
Because the whole time I'm watching him, I'm thinking, that's the Will Jacobs I know. Right? That's the Will Jacobs. The second question I have is a probing question for you.
Yes.
Is a moment enough?
Well, yes. Yes, ultimately. So that title, that sentiment comes from a short story written by Fyodor Dostoevsky titled White Nights, and that's the conclusion that the protagonist makes. For those of you who don't know, the short story follows this young man who wanders the streets during in late 19th century Russia during the White Nights phenomenon. That's where you have 24-hour daylight, or twilight, that is. So he's wandering around with insomnia, and he encounters this young woman who's distraught. And you learn that this woman is abandoned by this lover, and she's waiting for him to return. And by consoling this woman, they both fall in love with one another, and they continue to revisit each other each night at the place that they met, to have these conversations and to learn more about each other. And so eventually, I don't want to spoil much, but something happens which tears this girl away from our protagonist, and he comes to this conclusion where a moment of bliss, isn't that enough? Isn't that sufficient for a man?
It's precious. This moment is a precious moment. There's no doubt about it.
Right.
You know, to see him reliving what was and considering that to have been enough, even though I think probably somewhere deep inside him, and she also realized that it wasn't enough.
Yeah.
There needed to be more.
Yes. Of course, yeah. Well, that's the tension between the two characters, because they have opposing worldviews. How do you reconcile that? I mean, you do have that quote from Scripture that what does a believer share with an unbeliever? Love, yes. But you know, what kind of love? What quality of love? And we all have different definitions of what that is. And then, of course, with Shane, it's the ultimate love. It's this divine love.
It's the agape.
Yes, exactly.
A holistic view of love.
Yes.
Love with a capital L.
Yes, absolute love.
But if I might add something to what you shared a moment ago about is a moment enough? That whole scene is playing out because, obviously it's, like you said, it wasn't enough, but it needs to be enough. And so the whole film is really Shane's reconciliation of that predicament.
Okay.
I'd like to move on. This gentleman had a question.
What is the target audience for this film?
Target audience is a very good question.
Teenagers, general, whatever.
The whole breadth of humanity, really. It's because I think there's an element of everything in this story. Speaking of the feature film, and you saw an excerpt of the feature film, so of course the notion of sacred and profane love is explored, and I think that's something that's quite pertinent to our time today. What with all the skepticism, the ideal being replaced with a question mark, and so a lot of people are oscillating between the two. What do I choose? Do I choose to dedicate myself to these unattainable ideals, and do I continually pursue them, or do I make compromises and let go of that? And ultimately, we have nothing to attain, and we have no ideal to attain. Then what do we attain? Ultimately, to answer your question, everyone. We see a portrait of a young life in modernity. We also see a portrait of an older man, a middle-aged man who's facing this midlife malaise and is struggling to raise a daughter as a recently divorced person. And so he's also an educator. He teaches an art class at a college, and he grapples with the question of how can I impart the wisdom and culture of the West's past onto the youth.
For the 15-minute preview, the tone and the pace was fine. How do you think that's going to play out for the feature?
So the feature film will have a very similar aesthetic approach. Of course, somebody brought up how countercultural it is to Hollywood filmmaking in regards to the rapidity of the editing and having a barrage of the soundtrack and what have you, and told how to feel about things. And so I'm well aware of how slow this film is. It's not really deliberate. It just happens to be that when you're working with the medium of time, which is distinct to cinema, when you're capturing time, in the words of Andrei Tarkovsky, the Russian filmmaker, you're sculpting with time. And so, in his book, Sculpting with Time, he addresses this time pressure that occurs when you film a very long take without cutting at all. There's this pressure that occurs. It's almost this small miracle that happens. And if you think about, what it takes to make images in filmmaking, it takes a miracle. You have to, everything has to come into alignment. You're capturing lightning in a bottle. We only used one take. Every filmmaker just uses one take. There are many other takes that weren't shown, but we chose one because something occurred. Everything aligned in that moment. So, to answer your question, the rest of the film, yes, we'll have a similar pace as to what you see in the short film.
For Rachel and Wes, what was your preparation like for that interaction, for that lightning in the bottle moment? Near the end, where you have that kind of dance.
Well, Will wrote a very beautiful script, and it was a matter of stepping into that place and giving it our all, giving something authentic. So it was a mindset.
For me, it wasn't a different language for me because I have been a theater artist in the past, and you only get one shot each night to do anything that you're doing, and so it was a major blessing to have sometimes a couple of takes to try something again, and that was a really fun experience for me. But my approach was similar to anything I've done in the distant past, which was prepare it all beforehand, do all your emotional prep work, and then just show up and you just be with the person that you're with on the roller coaster.
Anyway, when it came to the casting process, I wanted to find people whose souls were closely reflecting the actual characters. And that way, it gave them the chance to just exist and not to pretend, not to feign anything, but to actually to live and to open the doors to their own soul. And there's a real authenticity to the performances because of that. And I was very grateful to find both Wes and Rachel. Yes?
I would like to hear you guys describe what emotional preparation looks like.
Oh, interesting.
Being human is very helpful.
That's really true. That's really true. I think, from my experience, preparing to act is making sure you know who the person is that you're showing up as and what you want from the other person. So it's really just, I'm this girl that's showing up in the imagination of this young man that these two people had something together, and I'm here to try to get that back. And so you just show up and start saying your lines with that knowledge, and then he reacts in certain ways, and I'm like, oh, okay, I gotta try harder, or, ooh, I just won that, or, wow, this is really great right now, or that's terrible, and you just live in the truth of what that is. But it's hard to get there, so you just gotta relax into it.
So, Will, is the entire full film, Poet in the Modern World, does it center on these two? And then there are others who enter that same. My question is based in this: where in the feature film does this snippet happen?
So it's towards the middle of the story.
Because I wanted to know what came before this.
Yes.
I wanted to know more about what came before this.
Yes.
At that moment.
Yes, well, the scene that precedes the scene that you just watched follows the instructor alone in his home. There's this instance that occurs where he has a special time with his daughter. So his ex-wife drops off his daughter for the weekend so he can spend time with her. And the power goes out. And this is during the bleak, frigid midwinter time. And it's so cold that the power goes out. And of course, his daughter's distraught, and he wanders into the room to console her. And there's this long monologue about fear and death, and it's this beautiful, beautiful moment between him and his daughter. And then this scene follows.
I was intrigued by the fact that right at the beginning it had him looking out the window with snow, and at the end, so I wondered if that environment was essential to telling the story. Is the winter part of it necessary to tell the story?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I figured it probably was. Because
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, who said the line? Who was that a quote from? Melancholy is my...
Kierkegaard.
Kierkegaard. That's
Soren Kierkegaard.
Yeah.
Yes, from Either Or. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad you caught that.
Mr. Scott. I know I've heard that.
Yes.
Now, on that last part where you're looking out the window and her side was, the shades were like kind of torn off, like she's the distraught person, and his side was more, neat, just, was that purposely done in that reason because of, or was it just, that's how the shades were, that's what I was going to ask.
It was not deliberate, that's how the shades were. We filmed in my friend's apartment, which is located near the Bradley campus. It's a very old house. He rented the uppermost floor of his house. It was built in the 30s, I believe. And it had this old gable door. And I envisaged the scene as I was writing it in this room, because this room had such a quality to it. And there were a lot of problems when it came to lighting that room because it was all white. So how can you control light without having it spill everywhere in a white room? Because white walls bounce light. So we had to figure out how to channel light with this grid and placed on the softbox so that we made these little channels to orient the light forward and not spill on the walls. Anyhow, to answer your question, yes, those windows were like that. The blinds.
Like he did it purposely because it did kind of fit in, you know what I mean? That's what I'm trying to say. Even though it wasn't, but it did fit in because the woman was strong, woman looking out, looking for, anyways, that was a good one.
Yes.
So always remember those little things like that catch people's eyes.
Yes, absolutely. And that was a discovery made on the day, and I told Rachel to interact with the blind.
I wanted to know who destroyed that.
Previous tenants, I don't know. God knows what occurred. But this is a quote by Robert Bresson. He wrote a book called Notes on the Cinematograph. He was disputably the father of the French New Wave, where you had Godard and Truffaut and all these other French filmmakers in the 60s. Anyhow, he had a minimalistic approach to cinema, but he had this quote, and the quote is, when you do not know what you're doing and what you're doing is best, that is inspiration. And so there are things that you invent in the moment that just occur and happen. It's almost as if you're given this little gift. And so you have to be attentive as a filmmaker and grab a hold of those things.
The serendipity that occurs when you show up at a real location to make something real, even though it's a script. The people are real, the room is real. It's flesh and blood becoming this story. And so the blinds, as you pointed out, is one of those moments of serendipity that really solidifies the reality of the act. It's very precious.
How many times, you said you had 4 takes on each scene, essentially.
Yes.
How many times did you say, the first take was the best?
Oh, there were a few shots where the first take was good.
I'd That's the way Will likes to work too. He likes to rehearse and then get the thing as soon as possible because film is not cheap.
No,
It's not. It's an extremely fragile medium.
Exactly. There's a lot of risk. So it coerces you to rehearse and to plan and to be deliberate and to strategize, to know what you're doing. And everybody keeps this delicacy of the format in mind. And so it demands everyone to operate at their utmost. And that's how I like to work. I like to be challenged. I like to be forced to work at my best.
Seems like one of the colors that you enjoy painting with as an artist is audio. And your attention to sliding things across the desk and for that to be a part of the soundtrack for the film is part of the mood. I'd be interested in hearing how that process was for you, what that was like, how much was on set in real time and how much was added later.
Yes. So, of course, I'm very fond of Rasan, who favored sound over images. He thought sound was the superior format. But to answer your question, the only sound that was recorded on set was when there was dialogue. And I had to record some of the dialogue without the camera running, because the camera does generate noise. It's a mechanical instrument. Yeah, a little like that. Less like a rattlesnake, but in the vicinity.
A little lower fish.
So I had to put a sound barring, that's what they call it. It's like a little garment you put over the film magazine to dampen the sound. That we recorded dialogue during the rehearsals. So I was able to use some of that because there was some noise interference within the actual takes, so I had to edit. But everything else had no sound, so it was up to me to invent the entire soundscape to correspond with the imagery. So with sound, my approach is minimalism. I don't like Hollywood today, where everything, you're barraged for all these booms and what have you. I like only featuring a few sounds. There's something very painterly about it and more potent and poetic. And then not to chase poetry, but somehow less sound makes the images more powerful. Because that's ultimately the origin of filmmaking. You had the silent era. There wasn't sound to begin with until they accompanied music with it. Anyhow.
The thing about sound is it's still full, even if you're not using a lot of it.
Right.
May I have your attention for a minute? Just a minute. I have made a short film for you. It is a story about a young artist haunted by his past muse during a cold and blustery winter day. Two dear friends of mine portray the characters. Wes Brooks and Rachel Walden. I am grateful to have had a few other helpful friends at my side. The production took place in my hometown of Peoria, Illinois. The film is entitled A Moment is Enough. It is a glimpse of a greater project that I would like to make soon. The film will be screened at various venues around central Illinois, and I hope that you will come and see it with me. It should be a beautiful experience.